8 seconds. That's all it takes for a life to vanish without a trace. 8 seconds to descend into a place where hope becomes a weapon, where faith is twisted into a mechanism of control, and where the human mind is taught to worship the very hands that will end it. Imagine a mountain shrouded in perpetual fog, silent except for the sound of your own heartbeat echoing against stone walls. In the winter of 1883, a widow named Margaret Thornton rode into the Colorado Rockies seeking a miracle. She would never leave alive. No letter, no photograph, no final word would escape the mountain. Only her name carved in a ledger that promised salvation but delivered something far darker. The Mountain View Healing Sanatorium was not merely a hospital. It was a fortress of illusion, carefully designed to isolate, to control, to persuade every soul within its walls that suffering was sacred, that pain was purification, that death was deliverance. Dr. William Crawford, a Harvard-trained surgeon with a reputation that gleamed like polished silver in Boston and New York, had come here with a vision framed as divine, yet executed with calculated precision. His sister Mary, known as Sister Mary, moved through the halls with the calm of a saint, her gentle voice masking a mind capable of methodical cruelty. And then there was Reverend James Crawford, expelled from congregations for theological irregularities, whose voice could command a room and whose presence lured the desperate into obedience. The location was everything. A natural shelf of granite, 8,000 feet above the valleys below, isolated by treacherous mountain trails and harsh winters. It was breathtaking, inspiring awe and fear. No one could escape. No one could call for help. All communication flowed through the hands of the Crawfords. The sheriff of the nearby town, generously compensated, ensured discretion. The patient's world ended where the mountain began. And behind the polished veneer of prayer and healing, behind sermons of divine alignment, the Crawfords were preparing a mechanism of absolute psychological domination, a system in which every human instinct for survival would be subverted, every hope for rescue meticulously extinguished. The first patient arrived not knowing she would be part of a long, meticulously executed sequence of orchestrated deaths. She entered a world where light was dim, where smells of incense and chemicals mingled in the air, and where every act of care concealed a slow, deliberate destruction. Morphine became devotion, restraints became ritual, suffering became virtue. And as the first day ended, Margaret Thornton, like so many who would follow, began her journey toward a transformation no one survived to recount. This is not a tale for the faint-hearted. The Mountain View Sanatorium is not a story about failure or accident or greed. It is a story of control, of hidden agendas, of a human psyche manipulated with surgical precision. And it is only the beginning. The Crawfords did not merely kill with medicine, they killed with belief. Every corner of Mountain View was engineered to command obedience, to convince the mind that surrender was salvation. Patients awoke each morning to a schedule that blurred the line between care and indoctrination. Breakfast was ritual. Dr. Crawford spoke from his pulpit in the dining hall, delivering what he called therapeutic sermons. Medical terminology fused seamlessly with divine command, weaving an invisible net of authority around each soul. The body is a vessel, he would declare, and when the soul aligns with God's will, the flesh must follow. Every word was a blade, every pause a trap. The patients were not being healed, they were being conditioned. Sister Mary glided between the tables with her tea, a warm smile masking a mind of relentless calculation. Her hands poured herbal concoctions, blessed in secret ceremonies, drugs disguised as devotion. Each sip a lesson in obedience, each blessing a silent promise of release from worldly suffering. And in the chapel, Reverend James orchestrated the crescendo. His prayer circles were not mere rituals. They were performances designed to wear down the body while inflating the ego of the spirit. Patients were encouraged to give themselves completely, to surrender fully, and the more they believed, the faster they succumbed. He could sense when a soul was ready, when the illness had progressed beyond the body's limits, when their fear and hope had intertwined into perfect submission. That was the moment the Crawfords called transformation. It was not immediate. The first days were subtle, seductive. Patients felt uplifted, hopeful, convinced they were witnessing miracles. Margaret Thornton wrote in her journal of renewed strength, of the peace that passes understanding. But the peace was a chemical illusion, orchestrated by doses of morphine that increased each day. The body relaxed, the mind soared, the will dissolved. What Margaret thought was divine grace was, in fact, methodical erosion. By the third day, she was moved to a private chamber in the basement, a sanctification room carved into solid granite. Dim light, walls lined with crosses and images of martyrdom, and a pervasive scent, incense mixed with chloroform. Here, isolation became punishment. Here, obedience became a ritual of death. Every element of Mountain View was a psychological trap. The remote location ensured dependency. The worship of the Crawfords reinforced authority. The illusion of healing intensified trust. Patients did not fight back, they believed fighting would oppose God. And while the world outside the mountain remained oblivious, the Crawfords perfected a system that combined faith, fear, and chemical submission into a weapon that left no survivors. They were not accidental killers. They were architects of a machine designed to dominate body, mind, and spirit, turning hope into terror, devotion into death. And for those like Margaret, the moment the morphine took hold, the final prayer was not salvation. It was the precise moment when the illusion became reality. They were already lost. By the third day, Margaret Thornton was no longer just a patient. She had become a subject in an experiment disguised as salvation. The Crawfords called it the accelerated healing protocol, a term that masked the orchestration of death with the language of divine progress. Margaret was moved to the basement sanctification chamber, a room carved into solid granite, accessible only through the secret tunnel system. The walls were covered with crosses, biblical verses, and images of saints enduring suffering, all designed to psychologically reinforce that pain was sacred, and that suffering was the gateway to heaven. A single oil lamp flickered dimly, casting elongated shadows that danced across the faces of painted martyrs, silent witnesses to what was about to unfold. Dr. Crawford's instructions were precise. Morphine, administered in incrementally lethal doses, was disguised as spiritual medicine. Sister Mary read scripture beside her, her voice a soft counterpoint to the chemical sedation, reinforcing that this was not death but purification. Every inhalation of the sweet, cloying air, part incense, part chloroform, disoriented the senses, leaving the body pliable and the mind obedient. Margaret's journal entries from that day would later reveal a chilling juxtaposition. She felt honored, chosen, elevated, and yet, every page would bear the unconscious mark of betrayal, a record of her own body's gradual surrender to what she thought was divine will. And then came Reverend James. The final prayer was a performance perfected over decades, a ritual of dominance. He would place his hands upon the patient's head, invoking God's will, praising the soul for its readiness, while Dr. Crawford adjusted the morphine drip to ensure no one survived beyond the ceremony. The moment of death was choreographed with the precision of a maestro conducting a symphony. Breath slowed, eyes dimmed, limbs relaxed. In the Crawfords' language, the patient ascended. But outside, no light awaited. Only the cold certainty that hope had been weaponized, and that the faith they had surrendered was the very instrument of their demise. The psychology was as lethal as the medicine. By the time a patient realized that what was happening was irreversible, their mind had been conditioned to accept it. Every moment of fear was reframed as divine purpose. Every sensation of weakness became a moral triumph. Patients did not resist. They worshipped the hands that ended them. Margaret Thornton's transformation, like those who would follow, was total. Body, mind, and spirit meticulously aligned with the Crawfords' machine of control. Outside observers, if there had been any, would never have believed the orchestration. Inside, it was methodical, cold, and unflinchingly human. This was no accident, no failing of medicine or faith. This was a system built to manipulate hope, distort reality, and turn devotion into death. Margaret's journey into the sanctification chamber was the first of 144 calculated disappearances, a process that would stretch over decades, hidden in plain sight, leaving the world outside blind to the horror carved into the granite of Mountain View. By the end of the first week, the Mountain View Sanatorium had already begun to shape its first pattern of control. The Crawfords understood that true domination required more than chemicals or isolation. It required the complete reshaping of reality itself. Every morning, patients rose to the same routine, each movement choreographed to reinforce obedience. Meditation in private chambers, sermons at the dining hall, communal prayers in the chapel, all carefully designed to erase independence, to make each individual doubt their own perceptions. Margaret Thornton, once a widow seeking a miracle, was now learning to measure her life not in days or hours, but in moments of alignment with the Crawfords' will. Fear was subtle but pervasive. A missed prayer, a question too boldly asked, a flicker of hesitation. Each small infraction was met with a look, a word, or a gesture that carried the weight of authority. Reverend James possessed a unique talent. He could sense doubt, detect hesitation, and channel it into self-condemnation. Patients internalized this. They began to monitor themselves, policing their own thoughts and actions, unknowingly participating in their own subjugation. Meanwhile, Sister Mary ensured that physical comfort remained just enough to prevent rebellion. Illness, sleep deprivation, and the increasing influence of morphine blurred the line between suffering and devotion. Every patient became a willing participant in their own undoing. The isolation of Mountain View was a critical tool. Letters from family were delayed or intercepted. News of the outside world arrived filtered, edited, and controlled. The nearest town, Elhorn, seemed distant in both miles and reality, accessible only through treacherous mountain trails and the Crawfords' selective mediation. Patients began to see the mountain as the entire universe. What lay beyond it became myth, and the Crawfords became gods in the only world that mattered. Every room, every corridor, every chamber reinforced the narrative. Survival depended on obedience. Healing, they were told, was only possible if the soul was aligned with divine purpose, and if the soul resisted, death was not punishment, but reward. And then there was the cycle of selection. Dr. Crawford and his sister observed, catalogued, and analyzed every response, every weakness, every flicker of hope or fear. Patients were chosen for accelerated healing, with no clear logic but the appearance of divine randomness. Those selected were moved to sanctification chambers, subjected to the lethal combination of morphine, chloroform, prayer, and psychological conditioning. Others watched, learning through observation that resistance was futile, that surrender was survival, or at least the illusion of it. In this way, Mountain View became a self-reinforcing machine. Faith, fear, and obedience were fused into a single, inescapable system. No one realized the magnitude of the Crawfords' design. Every act of devotion, every whispered prayer, every tear shed in hope or fear, was absorbed into the machinery of death. The patients did not see themselves as trapped. They saw themselves as chosen. And yet, beneath the surface of sanctity, the Crawfords were quietly perfecting the method that would claim 144 lives, leaving no trace outside the mountain, and rewriting the definition of faith as a tool of total domination. Inside the sanctification chambers, the reality of Mountain View crystallized into a form of psychological torment no one could escape. Margaret Thornton, like the others who would follow, began to experience a new kind of awareness, one that blurred devotion with dread, hope with despair. Every whispered prayer from Reverend James, every soft recitation from Sister Mary, every note of assurance from Dr. Crawford, became a tool of manipulation. Patients learned to equate obedience with divine reward, and fear with spiritual failure. The mind, deprived of autonomy, began to betray itself, creating illusions of miracles while the body silently deteriorated. The Crawfords understood this perfectly. By controlling the environment, the routine, and even the very air their patients breathed, they ensured the mind would begin to fold in on itself. Margaret's journal, later found by investigators, described moments of bliss, moments when she believed her body was being healed by God, and moments of terror, as the morphine dulled her awareness while the chloroform clouded every sense. She was learning, unknowingly, the most terrifying lesson of all, that reality could be rewritten, that the truth could be hidden behind the comforting veil of faith. Every heartbeat, every breath, Every flutter of hope became part of the Crawfords' experiment in obedience. The sanctification chamber itself was a masterpiece of psychological engineering. Dim light, oppressive stone, and religious iconography forced patients to confront mortality constantly. The murals of martyrs in agony reminded them that suffering was noble, that endurance was a virtue. The scent of incense blended with chemical agents, triggering a Pavlovian response. Calm, submission, compliance. Even when conscious, patients were disoriented, questioning what was real and what was illusion. Margaret, alone in the room, began to pray with fervor. Not for escape, not for survival, but to demonstrate her faith, her readiness, her worthiness of the healing promised by the Crawfords. And then came the most sinister element: observation. Hidden tunnels allowed the Crawfords to monitor every reaction, every expression of fear or hope, every hesitation. Nothing escaped their scrutiny. Patients became actors in a play they did not understand, performing devotion under the watchful eyes of those who knew their ultimate fate. They learned quickly that resistance brought only despair, while compliance brought the fleeting illusion of safety. By the end of her first week, Margaret Thornton, like all who entered Mountain View, had internalized the most dangerous lesson: that surrender was not optional, that faith itself could be weaponized, and that the mountain demanded total obedience. This was the moment when hope became a chain, faith became a trap, and the human spirit became the tool of its own destruction. Margaret Thornton's mind had been captured before her body was even fully broken, setting the stage for the first orchestrated death. The moment the Crawford system revealed its true, horrifying power. The moment arrived quietly, almost imperceptibly. Margaret Thornton, now fully conditioned by days of prayer, medication, and isolation, was led into the sanctification chamber for her first, accelerated healing session. To any observer, it would have appeared serene. A room bathed in flickering lamplight, the faint aroma of incense curling through the air. Yet beneath the calm was a system of ruthless calculation, a choreography of death perfected over years of unspoken practice. Dr. Crawford's hand hovered over the morphine drip, adjusting the dosage with precision. Sister Mary's voice, soft and unwavering, recited scripture that convinced Margaret this was not harm, but divine purification. And above it all, Reverend James intoned prayers that made surrender feel like transcendence. The physical transformation was slow, deliberate. Morphine numbed the body, chloroform clouded the senses, and each breath grew shallower. Margaret's eyes, once bright with hope, began to dim, reflecting both fear and a strange reverence for what she believed was God's work. The Crawfords had engineered the perfect combination of chemical submission and psychological conditioning. At no point did the patient realize the full extent of what was happening. The mind rationalized every sensation as part of the healing process. Every tremor, every faint gasp, every fleeting panic became a sign of spiritual progress. The sanctification chamber amplified the terror. Carved into solid granite, its walls seemed to close in with every moment. Painted martyrs gazed down with expressions of agony and triumph, a constant reminder that suffering was holy. Margaret felt herself shrinking into the ritual, becoming both participant and observer of her own undoing. Reverend James's voice rose to a crescendo, declaring that she was ready, that her soul had been purified, that she would ascend. And then, with the calculated precision of a surgeon, Dr. Crawford increased the morphine to lethal levels. Margaret's body obeyed, slipping into unconsciousness. Her final breaths were a symphony of control, a testament to the Crawfords' mastery of body and mind. The healing was complete. Margaret Thornton would never leave Mountain View alive. Yet to the other patients it appeared divine, sanctified, an example of what faith could accomplish. Fear rippled through the halls, teaching submission and obedience. Those who observed learned quickly. Resistance was meaningless. The Crawford system had not only claimed a life, it had transmitted its lesson to the living, reinforcing the machinery of control. Each death was an experiment, each ritual a method for refining the psychological trap that had ensnared 144 souls before the world even knew the mountain existed. The Crawfords did not simply kill. They perfected a cycle where faith, fear, and obedience converged into a weapon. Margaret Thornton's death was not an anomaly. It was the blueprint, the first visible proof that hope could be engineered, that devotion could be exploited, and that the human spirit could be weaponized against itself. And it was only the beginning. The deaths at Mountain View were not isolated. They were instruments, lessons carved into the minds of the living. When Margaret Thornton's body was silently removed, hidden behind the walls of the basement crypt, her absence became a ghostly message to the others. They did not speak of it aloud, for words were dangerous in a place where every action was watched, where every hesitation was noted. Instead, they internalized the lesson. Compliance ensured comfort, devotion promised survival, and resistance guaranteed suffering or worse. Fear was no longer an external force. It had become the architecture of their reality. Reverend James knew this. He orchestrated every moment to reinforce the lesson of mortality and obedience. Patients were encouraged to witness prayer circles, to see who was chosen for accelerated healing, to observe the rituals of sanctification. Each site was carefully controlled to provoke awe, anxiety, and a desperate need to align with the Crawfords' will. Those who faltered were quietly reprimanded, sometimes with increased doses of morphine, sometimes with the subtle withdrawal of attention or comfort. Every small act of noncompliance was weaponized, transforming doubt into guilt and fear into devotion. Sister Mary's role was equally vital. She appeared compassionate, offering blessings and soothing words, but her presence was a psychological lever. The tea she served, the scripture she recited, even her gentle touch, all were calculated to reinforce submission. Patients began to crave her approval, to see her as the arbiter of divine favor. The illusion was complete. Surrender became not only inevitable, but desirable. The mind itself was now complicit in its own control. The daily routines became more elaborate, more subtle in their manipulation. Meditation, sermons, prayer circles, and communal meals were synchronized to keep the body weak and the mind pliable. Sleep was regulated, nourishment controlled, and every interaction carefully monitored. Patients who had once resisted began to adjust their thoughts and behaviors unconsciously, policing themselves to avoid punishment, imagining reward in death, and clinging to hope as a tether that the Crawfords could cut at will. And the mountain itself, the isolation, the treacherous trails, the snowbound winters, acted as a silent enforcer. Escape was impossible. Even the idea of leaving became unthinkable. The outside world was myth, the Crawfords omnipotent. Every death reinforced the system, every ritual perfected the cycle. Patients were trapped not by bars or locks, but by the architecture of fear, the chemistry of obedience, and the illusion of divine purpose. By the time the second and third victims were chosen, Mountain View was no longer a sanatorium. It was a machine, meticulously engineered to break souls, one by one, in the guise of salvation. Mountain View was more than a house of healing. It was a vault of secrets. Beneath the grand facade of timber and stone, hidden behind false walls and carved into the granite of the mountain itself, lay the machinery that ensured no soul ever left alive. The Crawfords maintained meticulous records, ledgers noting each patient's arrival, every dose administered, each ritual performed, and the precise moment of death. Names, dates, and divine progress were cataloged with obsessive precision. These records, stored in a hidden chamber accessible only through a narrow tunnel, became a macabre testament to the family's control. A ledger not of life, but of calculated death. The logistics were flawless. Morphine, chloroform, and herbal compounds were carefully measured, timed, and administered. Meals and medications were coordinated to weaken resistance. The tunnels connecting the basement chambers to the main building allowed the Crawfords to move freely without being seen, monitoring the patient's reactions, adjusting treatments, and ensuring absolute compliance. When a patient died, removal was quiet, deliberate, and ritualized. No body left the mountain, no evidence reached the valley below. It was as if these people had vanished into thin air, leaving only the Crawfords' careful documentation to mark their existence. The secrecy extended beyond the mountain walls. The nearby town of Elhorn was complicit, whether through fear, bribes, or awe. Sheriff Frank Jameson, generously compensated, turned a blind eye to unusual shipments, missing persons, and suspicious disappearances. Mail, telegraph, and visitor access were filtered, controlled, and censored. The outside world saw a remote, respectable Christian sanatorium in the Rockies, a sanctuary of hope. Inside, it was a laboratory of obedience, a theater of death. Every element reinforced the illusion of divine purpose. Patients never suspected that the very schedules, the prayers, and the meditations meant to heal them were instead precise instruments of psychological domination. Even hope was weaponized. The belief that God was observing, that faith could transform, that the suffering was temporary, all reinforced the Crawfords' invisible chains. By cataloging every reaction, every sign of submission, the Crawfords refined their methods with ruthless efficiency. Each patient became both subject and experiment, a piece in a meticulously engineered cycle of control and death. Mountain View's true horror was its perfection. No one could escape it alive, and no one outside could discover its secrets. The Crawfords' machine ran quietly, invisibly perfect. Yet within those stone walls, 144 lives were being measured, molded, and ultimately erased. Each one a lesson in obedience, each death a confirmation of the Crawfords' mastery over body, mind, and spirit. By the time investigators would finally uncover the hidden crypt decades later, the scale of the operation would shock the nation, yet fail to fully convey the psychological brilliance of its design. Control so total it ensured complicity in one's own destruction. By the second week, Mountain View's machinery of control had reached full momentum. Patients no longer questioned the reality around them, they internalized it. Fear had become a constant pulse in every heartbeat, obedience a reflex, and devotion a cage. The sanctification chambers were no longer just sites of healing. They had become theaters of ritualized terror. Those awaiting their turn watched silently, absorbing every detail, the soft cadence of morphine-induced breathing, the rise and fall of Reverend James's voice, the unwavering gaze of Sister Mary reading scripture beside the slowly fading body. Each scene was a lesson, a signal. Surrender is survival. The psychological collapse was subtle, yet complete. Sleep cycles were disrupted, meals were regimented, and patients' minds were saturated with religious indoctrination. The combination of isolation, chemical sedation, and ritual observance created a state in which rational thought became impossible. Even the strongest wills began to fracture, folding into the Crawfords' imposed narrative. A patient might recognize their peril for a fleeting second, only to repress the thought, convincing themselves that their suffering was noble, their impending death sacred. By the time they realized the full scope of the system, it was too late. Their minds were already complicit in the mechanism that would end their lives. Reverend James orchestrated this with terrifying precision. His prayer circles became increasingly intense, bordering on theatrical. He would call on patients to declare their faith aloud, to confront their own weakness, to internalize their fear as virtue. Each declaration reinforced the Crawfords' power, turning collective anxiety into obedience. The patients learned to monitor one another, silently enforcing compliance through shared terror. No rebellion was possible. The social structure itself became a weapon. Every glance, every whisper, every tremor of doubt was observed, recorded, and used to tighten the cycle of control. Sister Mary's role amplified the effect. Her gentle demeanor and constant presence were a psychological lever. Patients craved her reassurance, mistaking it for divine approval. When a patient faltered, her withdrawal, however subtle, became a punishment far more effective than physical force. The illusion of care had become a tool of manipulation, ensuring that submission was internalized, even sought. Obedience was no longer enforced externally. It had been absorbed, cultivated, and reinforced within each mind. This was not chaos. It was a system perfected over decades. Fear, hope, devotion, and death intertwined into a single inescapable loop. Each death reinforced the lessons of control for the survivors, and the Crawfords observed it all, refining the process, testing responses, cataloging behaviors. By the end of the second week, Margaret Thornton, like the others, had become an actor in a play she neither wrote nor understood, performing devotion under the absolute authority of those who had already determined her fate. In Mountain View, surrender was not optional, it was inevitable, and the mind itself became the instrument of its own destruction. The Crawfords understood a dark truth. The ultimate weapon of control is belief. By the third week, patients were not merely compliant, they craved the approval of their executioners. To reinforce this, the Crawfords created what they called graduation ceremonies, a grotesque inversion of celebration where death was presented as ultimate achievement. Those selected for accelerated healing were prepared for these rituals with weeks of observation, conditioning, and chemical sedation. Their minds, weakened and malleable, were convinced that the approaching end was not punishment, but a sacred honor. Reverend James led these ceremonies with dramatic precision. The room was arranged like a cathedral of shadows. Oil lamps cast flickering light across walls adorned with religious iconography, portraying saints in stages of suffering and triumph. Patients were dressed in their best, their bodies subtly weakened by controlled doses of morphine, yet their minds were intoxicated with devotion. The congregation of fellow patients watched silently, understanding their place in the hierarchy of survival. The act of witnessing reinforced the system. Submission was celebrated, resistance erased. Sister Mary played the role of both comforter and enforcer. She would sit beside the chosen patient, reading scripture and murmuring blessings that reinforced the illusion of divine approval. Each word, each gesture, was a carefully calibrated reinforcement of obedience. The patient, feeling honored and exalted, would often accept their fate willingly, believing that their death was a gateway to something higher. It was a perverse transformation. Fear became reverence, terror became hope, and surrender became exaltation. Dr. Crawford controlled the mechanics of the ceremony with surgical precision. Morphine and chloroform were administered at carefully measured intervals, weakening the body while leaving the mind just coherent enough to embrace the ritual. Every breath, every sigh, every fleeting resistance was observed and recorded. At the climax, Reverend James would pronounce the final blessing, and the patient would slip into unconsciousness, their last moments framed as divine ascension. Outside observers, if they existed, would have seen only a ceremony of piety. Inside, it was a calculated orchestration of death disguised as spiritual triumph. The remaining patients absorbed every detail. Each graduation ceremony became a lesson in obedience, a visual manifesto of the Crawfords' power. They learned to crave selection, to perform devotion, and to internalize the notion that mortality was a reward rather than a threat. Mountain View was no longer simply a sanatorium. It was a psychological theater where life and death, fear and faith, were fused into a single instrument of absolute control. By the end of each week, the Crawfords had not only eliminated a patient, they had reinforced their dominion over every living soul in the facility. Not every patient succumbed immediately. Some resisted, even within the suffocating shadow of Mountain View. One man, a former engineer named Thomas Harlan, attempted to challenge the system. He whispered questions in the dining hall, hesitated during prayers, and subtly refused to participate fully in the rituals. For a brief, fragile moment, he clung to the idea that reason and autonomy still had power. But the Crawfords had anticipated defiance. They understood that control was never just physical, it was psychological. Reverend James noticed the first signs of rebellion during a midweek prayer circle. His voice, calm but piercing, singled out Thomas without explicitly naming him. "Faith is not measured in hesitation," he intoned, his eyes sweeping the room. Sister Mary withdrew her attention from Thomas, just enough to create a gnawing sense of absence, a subtle punishment that sent chills through his psyche. Dr. Crawford adjusted his treatment schedule, increasing doses just enough to weaken the body, leaving the mind vulnerable to suggestion. Within hours, Thomas's courage began to crumble. The fear he felt was immediate, instinctive, and total. The Crawfords amplified the lesson with ritualized intimidation. Thomas was moved into a smaller chamber, ostensibly for personal reflection and purification. But in reality, it was designed to isolate, terrify, and break him completely. The chamber's stone walls reverberated every sound, every footstep, every whispered scripture, magnifying the sensation of being watched. Lights flickered, incense swirled, and faint chemical odors assaulted the senses. Thomas's mind, now desperate for approval, finally bent. He complied, murmuring prayers he did not feel, performing gestures he did not intend. The rebellion was extinguished before it could take root. What followed was the Crawfords' masterstroke. The other patients witnessed Thomas's subjugation, silently, helplessly. They saw that descent led not to justice or liberation, but to intensified scrutiny, isolation, and subtle torment. Fear rippled outward, infecting every mind. The lesson was clear. The mountain demanded obedience, and even the strongest wills would break. Any thought of resistance was now paired with visceral memory of Thomas's humiliation and suffering, making rebellion unimaginable. By controlling one act of defiance, the Crawfords ensured the compliance of all. Mountain View was no longer merely a place of healing, it was a psychological prison. Each patient internalized the truth that submission was the only path to comfort, that faith was the currency of survival, and that resistance guaranteed suffering. The rebellion had failed, but its failure reinforced the Crawfords' dominion, teaching a lesson far more powerful than any sermon. That freedom of thought was a liability, and obedience was the ultimate survival skill. By the third month, Mountain View was no longer a sanatorium, it had become an ecosystem of obedience. Each patient's fear, devotion, and even whispered thoughts were woven into a network of control so intricate that rebellion became not only dangerous but inconceivable. The Crawfords had learned from every reaction, every flicker of hesitation, every subtle act of resistance. Observations were catalogued in the hidden ledgers, not merely as data, but as instruments for refining the system. Each interaction, each prayer, each subtle manipulation was now a component of a living machine designed to reshape human behavior at its most fundamental level. The rituals evolved. Prayer circles became more elaborate, designed to extract compliance through group psychology. Patients who faltered in faith were subtly shamed, their failures magnified to reinforce conformity among others. The sanctification chambers, once reserved for accelerated healing, were now tools of both observation and conditioning. Chemical agents and sleep deprivation continued to weaken the body, but the real power lay in the mind. The Crawfords had mastered the art of making submission feel sacred, of turning terror into devotion, and despair into a perceived opportunity for transcendence. Isolation, already profound, became even more absolute. The tunnels connecting the chambers allowed the Crawfords to move unseen, to monitor private reactions, and to deliver interventions before doubt could solidify. Patients began to internalize the rules of obedience. They watched each other, reported subtle transgressions, and became complicit in their own subjugation. Fear was no longer just an external force, it had become self-regulated, a feedback loop ensuring that even when the Crawfords were absent, their influence remained total. By now, the deaths themselves had become part of the system. Each graduation was observed by the survivors, embedding the lesson of submission deeply within the psyche. Those awaiting selection learned to crave approval, to anticipate their eventual fate with both terror and longing. The Crawfords had achieved a rare mastery. The illusion of free will had been preserved, even as every decision, every thought, every action was carefully manipulated. Obedience was no longer enforced, it was internalized, and in that internalization lay the most chilling proof of their power. At Mountain View, hope and fear, faith and mortality, were fused into a single instrument of control. Each patient became an agent of the system, a willing participant in a machine designed to claim 144 souls. The mountain itself, the isolation, the treacherous terrain, the harsh winters, was a silent enforcer, but the true force was psychological. By controlling perception, manipulating devotion, and orchestrating fear, the Crawfords had created a machine more precise than any scalpel, more absolute than any law. And now they were ready to refine it further, to escalate the terror, and to demonstrate that obedience could be transformed into a devotion so powerful that death itself would be welcomed. By now, you have seen how Mountain View shaped obedience into devotion, how fear became a form of worship, and how life itself was calibrated into a ritual of control. But what you may not realize is that this knowledge, the mechanics of psychological domination, the orchestration of submission, does something to the mind of anyone who witnesses it. It does not leave you neutral. It awakens something within, a recognition of systems hidden in plain sight, a glimpse of the machinery that shapes thought, behavior, and belief. And now, I ask you to do something unusual, something symbolic, to anchor this understanding. Comment the phrase, "I see the mountain below," twice. Let it serve as a marker, a declaration that you acknowledge the forces at work, both seen and unseen. Don't dismiss this as trivial. Symbols, repeated and observed, are powerful. They reinforce connection, cement awareness, and signal your participation in a deeper understanding of control and freedom. Comment it now, twice, and recognize that your mind is being trained to notice what others overlook, to see the hidden architecture of influence in the world around you. The patients at Mountain View did not have this choice. Their awareness, their fears, and their hope were harnessed against them. They were caught in a system that left no room for escape, no room for skepticism, and no room for doubt. By observing and engaging, you are stepping into a place they could never have reached, a vantage point where control can be studied, understood, and ultimately resisted. This is where Mountain View becomes more than a story. It becomes a lesson in power, in manipulation, and in the anatomy of compliance. You see how the Crawfords engineered every interaction, every ritual, every breath, to bend the mind and body in their favor. And now, as you witness it, you are invited to reflect. How many mountains exist in your own world, unseen, where obedience is expected, where fear is normalized, and where submission is mistaken for virtue? Recognizing them is the first step toward reclaiming autonomy. The next phase of the Crawford system was the most terrifying yet. It was not enough to condition individual obedience. They needed to transform collective perception, to create a culture within Mountain View where every patient not only submitted, but enforced the system upon others. And in doing so, the line between victim and agent blurred, creating a machine so precise, so self-perpetuating, that it could claim life after life without detection. By engaging with this knowledge, by repeating the symbolic phrase, you mark your own transformation. You step beyond passive observation into active awareness. And from here, the descent deepens. The next revelations will show how fear, ritual, and chemical influence converge to create a mechanism of death disguised as divine salvation, one patient at a time. By the 6th month, Mountain View had evolved into a machine unlike anything the outside world could imagine. The Crawfords had perfected a system where each patient's fear, hope, and obedience were harnessed not only for survival, but for the enforcement of the very structure that controlled them. Patients who had once resisted were now indoctrinated observers, silently policing one another, reinforcing rituals, and internalizing the notion that death was sacred and dissent forbidden. The line between victim and enforcer had disappeared. Every glance, every gesture, every whispered thought became a thread in the web of domination. The sanctification chambers had become laboratories of compliance. Each new patient was gradually immersed in the atmosphere of reverence and terror. They witnessed the graduation ceremonies, saw the carefully orchestrated deaths, and absorbed the lesson. Submission was exaltation, and resistance was annihilation. By observing, they became complicit. Their minds recorded patterns of control, learning to anticipate the Crawfords' methods, self-censoring and self-correcting before any explicit command was given. In essence, Mountain View had turned each patient into an agent of the system, a living extension of the Crawfords' power. Reverend James's orchestration of group psychology reached its zenith during this period. Prayer circles became hypnotic, almost ceremonial in rhythm, blending confession, fear, and praise. Patients were called upon to support one another, guiding those weaker in faith through ritualized exercises that reinforced submission. The energy in the room was electric, a collective consciousness conditioned to recognize authority as divine. Even small acts of hesitation were magnified, observed, and subtly punished by peers who had become enforcers without realizing it. The Crawfords had effectively weaponized empathy and social pressure, transforming community into control. Sister Mary's interventions were equally precise. She balanced comfort with manipulation, blessing patients while reinforcing their dependency on the Crawfords' approval. The perception of choice, of voluntary devotion, was carefully maintained, even as every pathway led to the same inevitable conclusion. Patients surrendered willingly, internalizing their own conditioning as virtue. Fear had become a companion, submission a ritual, and mortality a measure of faith. By now, every system in Mountain View, from chemical control to ritual observance to peer-enforced obedience, had converted into a single, self-perpetuating machine. One patient's transformation reinforced the next, creating a cascading effect that amplified psychological control exponentially. The Crawfords had not merely built a sanatorium, they had built a cathedral of compliance, where life, death, fear, and devotion were fused into a single instrument of power. It was precise, invisible, and unstoppable. The mountain held them, the rituals shaped them, and the system perfected itself with every passing day. The final chapter of Mountain View is not a story of isolated horror. It is a blueprint of absolute control, perfected over decades. By the time the last of the 144 patients entered the sanctification chambers, every aspect of the Crawford system had been honed to mechanical precision. Life and death were orchestrated with the same ruthless attention to detail that once guided surgical procedure. Every ritual, every prayer, every chemical administered, every whispered word from Sister Mary, and every solemn proclamation from Reverend James had been calibrated to break the body, dominate the mind, and sanctify submission as divine. The crypt behind the false wall in the basement became both ledger and monument. Names, dates, and the exact method of death were recorded with obsessive fidelity. It was not merely a record of mortality. It was a testament to power, a shrine to the Crawfords' mastery over life itself. Each patient's disappearance was a silent lesson for the next. The remaining survivors were now fully integrated into the system. Witnesses, participants, enforcers, ensuring the cycle continued without falter. Fear had become instinct, obedience second nature, and hope a manipulated instrument. By the time authorities would stumble upon the crypt decades later, the reality would be incomprehensible. 144 souls had vanished under the guise of divine healing, and yet the process had been methodical, intentional, and untraceable. The horror is not simply in the death of these individuals. It is in the perfection of the machine that claimed them. The Crawfords had transformed faith into a weapon, devotion into chains, and hope into compliance. They demonstrated, with chilling clarity, that when human psychology is understood and meticulously engineered, absolute domination is possible without overt violence. The patients had consented, had internalized the system, and had even reinforced it themselves. Mountain View was proof that control over perception is more lethal than any knife, and manipulation of belief can ensure the willing participation of those it enslaves. And now, as you reflect on these events, consider this: systems of control exist beyond the walls of that isolated Colorado mountain. They operate in subtle, unseen ways, through institutions, ideologies, and rituals that shape thought and obedience without overt coercion. The lesson of Mountain View is not just historical. It is a warning. Knowledge is power, awareness is survival, and recognition of these hidden structures is the first step in reclaiming agency. Remember the patience, remember the crypt, remember the lesson the Crawfords wrote into stone and mind, and understand that by seeing, acknowledging, and remembering, you step into a place they could never reach, a vantage point where fear can be recognized, manipulation exposed, and power reclaimed. The mountain stands silent, the crypt remains hidden, but the truth, the dangerous, transformative truth, now belongs to you. If this story unsettled you, if it pulled you deeper than any tale you've heard before, I want you to do more than just watch. I want you to claim the awareness this knowledge offers. Comment below the phrase, "I see the mountain." Not once, but twice, to mark that you are awake to truths most people will never see. Share this video with someone who you know craves the hidden knowledge others ignore. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the next story will take you even further down the path most fear to walk. And here's the most important part. Keep your mind sharp. Question everything, observe the systems around you, and recognize the mountains of control that surround us in plain sight. By engaging here, you're not just a viewer, you're a seeker, a witness, and now a part of this hidden understanding. Leave a comment describing what in this story shook you most. Your reflections aren't just for me, they become part of the collective awareness, the hidden dialogue of those who dare to see behind the veil. And remember, once you know, nothing will ever look the same again.